The problem about hearing a story more than once is that you don't really hear it the third or the fourth or the fifth or the sixth time. And so the Christmas story is one that we've heard possibly hundreds of times, which means that we don't really hear it. And so this morning I've amalgamated portions of Matthew's account of it and Luke's account in order to really create a kind of a chronology for what actually happened. And I invite you to imagine that you're somebody hearing it for the very first time. And I want you to wipe out your memory banks of previous accounts you've heard. And I want you to begin to climb aboard your imagination and see the events as they unfold. This is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. But before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law, and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone round them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Suddenly, a great company of the heavenly host appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to those on whom his favor rests." After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and the teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go, search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Take the child and his mother and escape Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go back there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he should be called a Nazarene. These are words inspired by God. There are, I believe, many reasons why God incarnates as babies, and why Jesus famously said to his own self-important apostles, "Unless you become like little children, you will not even enter the kingdom of God." So what was it that Jesus saw in little children that allowed him to make that statement? The apostles were arguing about who was going to be the most important person in the kingdom when Jesus finally revealed himself as the Messiah. And Jesus took a little child and stood the child in their midst and said, "Unless you become like this little child, you won't even enter the kingdom, let alone have high positions in some kind of government there." So what was Jesus pointing out to when he talked about children as the way to the kingdom? I think many, many attributes. The first one is children's extraordinary sense of awe. Children are fascinated by everything, literally everything. Lifting stones to find slugs, or painting the bathroom with their own poop. They're fascinated by everything. They go around with their eyes wide open in a sense of awe at the world into which they're just incarnated. He saw that. Secondly, kids ask the most extraordinarily important questions, the real questions, and we laugh at their kind of naivete. But when you actually listen, the kids are asking the really, really, really important kinds of questions. The third thing is that children are born prejudice-free. They have to be taught to be prejudiced. And certainly our world does an extraordinarily good job in inculcating prejudice into our children. And the fourth quality, I believe, is their children's extraordinary penchant for forgiving. No matter how badly they're abused by their parents, even in the early years, they still forgive their parents and want to be with their parents. And so Jesus could see all of these things. And that is why and how God chooses to be born again and again and again as little children, because every little child is a prophet for us. But we don't say that. And so today I want to pick up and I want to do a recap of the previous two homilies I gave on the Christmas story, and then open it up to a Q&A. And so for the last two Sundays, I've been talking about, the Christ event, the nativity event. And I started off by looking at the different accounts of the nativity that we find in both the canonical gospels and the extra-canonical or the deuterocanonical gospels. And I gave a quick timeline about when these gospels were actually written. So the first Christian writings come from about 50 CE of the Common Era, with the Gospel of Thomas, written about 50 CE. And it's basically just 114 different quotations from Jesus. Around the same time, there's a document which has never been recovered, but has been inferred because of its appearance when it's quoted elsewhere, and it's called Q, for the German word Quelle, meaning source. And that comes from the same time period as the Gospel of Thomas, from about 50 CE. Then comes the first canonical gospel written by Mark, about 70 AD, then Matthew, 80 AD, Luke, 90 AD, and John, 100 AD. And then a little bit later, you get two other gospels written about 150 AD, the infancy gospel of James and the infancy gospel of Thomas, which is different from the gospel of Thomas. So that was like the timeline of when we get these particular accounts. And I looked then at the question of by whom were they written and for whom were they written? Because they were written for very different audiences. And so there's a different emphasis in each gospel. So let's just look at the canonical gospels. The first one written was Mark. And Mark is very differently writing for a Gentile audience, very probably converts in Rome. So his entire focus is on convincing a converted Gentile audience about the Jewish Mashiach. Matthew is writing about 80 AD, and he very definitely has a Jewish audience in mind. So it's the most Jewish of the four Gospels. And Matthew is at pains to try to point out that Jesus is actually a kind of a reincarnation of Moses. He creates his entire gospel to reflect events in the life of Moses. So he organizes his gospel into 5 significant divisions to represent the Pentateuch, the 5 books allegedly ascribed to Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the very gospel is set up in 5 sections. He has an Exodus story in 2 parts. Just like the Israelites leaving Egypt and coming across the Sinai desert, Jesus as a little infant will have to reverse that and go from Israel down into Egypt to escape Herod, and then go back up a few years later. So he recapitulates that. We have the Pharaoh in the Hebrew scriptures trying to kill all the boy children, born to the Israelites. And now you have Herod in this story trying to kill all the boy children of 2 years of age and younger in Bethlehem. You have Moses being on Mount Sinai for 40 days and receiving the covenant or the law from God. And you have Jesus spending 40 days in the desert and receiving a new covenant from God. You have Moses feeding the people in the desert with manna, and you have Jesus feeding people in the desert with bread and fishes. So again and again and again, Matthew is trying to point out to his Jewish audience, Jesus is the fulfillment of the Hebrew scriptures, almost as if he's a reincarnation of Moses. Luke is very, very different. Luke is the only non-Jewish writer in the entire Bible, the only non-Jew to write a part of the Bible. And he wrote 2 books of the Bible, the Gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. And Luke is writing to our Gentile audience, in fact, to a specific individual called Theophilus. Theophilus literally means the one who loves God. So he may be saying, anybody who loves God needs to hear this story about the Jewish Messiah. Or maybe he's actually writing it to a Roman governor, and he's trying to convince this governor that the Jesus movement is not a political threat to Rome. And so he goes at pains to point out that even Pilate tried to excuse Jesus and said, I'm innocent of the blood of this man. So in Luke's gospel, it's pitched to an individual, to a very Gentile audience, to assure Rome that Christianity is not a threat to the empire. And then you've got the Gospel of John. And in actual fact, there are 3 different people probably here. You have John the Beloved, who sat with Jesus at the Last Supper, and the only one of the 12 not to be martyred for the faith, who moves out of Israel into Ephesus and the area of Asia Minor, and starts a church group there, and is looking after Jesus' mother Mary, as he'd been commissioned when Jesus was dying on the cross. And the leader of that church subsequently is called John the Elder. So he would have been a disciple, of John the Beloved. But it wasn't even John the Elder who wrote the gospel. Very probably it was another one called, obviously, John the Evangelist. So a second generation, a disciple of John the Beloved. So that's where John's gospel comes from, and is dedicated to a mixed audience in and outside of Israel. And I pointed out that there's quite a bit of plagiarizing goes on when you read through the gospel accounts. And so, for instance, there's this document that the German scholars inferred, because there are huge passages both in Matthew and Luke, which are word for word identical, but there is no other source that they can find from which they've come. So they called it literally Q, for quelle, meaning the source. And Matthew and Luke are borrowing very, very heavily from both Q and from Mark's Gospel, which was written beforehand. But then later versions of Mark's Gospel plagiarize versions of Luke's Gospel and John's Gospel. So although Mark is the first Gospel written, there are 3 different endings to Mark's Gospel. So at various stages, the original version was changed and they added on some other stories, particularly post-resurrection stories of Jesus that they borrowed from Luke's Gospel and from John's Gospel. So you have all this kind of plagiarizing going on. So that was the first piece I talked about, the sources and the authors of these accounts. Then I went on to talk about, trying to fill in the gaps. So when you just read the canonical Gospels, Mark says nothing about the birth of Jesus. John says nothing about the birth of Jesus. We only find it in Matthew and in Luke. And in Matthew, it's just basically the birth stories. In Luke, there's only one incident in his childhood. So there's nothing between, age 8 days and age 12 years, except one story where Jesus allegedly is lost in the temple and is debating with the scholars in the temple. And so there were other Gospels kind of rushed in to fill that lacuna between, age 8 days and age 12 years. And so there's a Gospel written about 150 CE. And it's called the Infancy Gospel of James. And it fills in a whole bunch of other stories about when Jesus was born and where he was born. And it was in a cave, not in a manger and not in a home, as you find in Matthew and Luke. And there's a whole different story about who delivered Mary and what happened subsequently. And I expounded on that a few weeks ago. And then there was a second Gospel written called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, where he's trying to fill in, the first 4 or 5 years. And what you get in this Gospel, Jesus comes across as a very troubled, vindictive child. He's like ADHD on steroids. It's a weird, weird Gospel. And I told you some of the stories from that a few weeks ago. And then the third group of stories I told you were from a source very close to my own heart. My great-grandmother, whom I called Muddy, the story she told me that I never found anywhere in the deuterocanonical Gospels or in the kind of canonical Gospels. Why donkeys have a cross on their back. I told you that story. Why crossbills are special birds, why their beaks are twisted, because they were trying to pull the nails out of Jesus when he was being crucified. And why you should never kill a spider, because they tried to disguise the cave in which the infant Jesus and Mary and Joseph were hiding when Herod's troops came looking for them. And why it was okay to kill a wren, because the wren was squealing and saying, they're in the cave, they're in the cave, they're in the cave. And I told you the story about my great-grandmother told me why Jesus was the only 6 foot tall human being ever to live. Nobody else on the planet was exactly 6 feet. You could be 5 feet 11 and a half, or you could be 6 feet and a half an inch, but there was nobody in the world ever that was just 6 feet high. And she explained to me how it happened. And when I had enough kind of sechel to be able to do mathematics, and I said, what happened if somebody is 6'1"? Didn't he have to be 6 feet at some stage when he was growing? She said, no. He went to bed at 5 feet 11 and a half, and while he was asleep, he grew to 6 feet and a half an inch. So he was never actually 6 feet because he was lying down, you couldn't measure him. So these were the stories, that I told about Jesus and the nativity. I looked at, for instance, where was Jesus actually born? And there are very many different versions. According to Matthew, he was born in a house. According to Luke, he was born in a stable and placed in a manger after being born. But according to the Infancy Gospel of James, he was born in a cave. So was it a house, was it a stable, or was it a cave? So take your pick. And the question then becomes for me is, it is not important where he was born, because God can be born anywhere. So there is no place in which God cannot be born, in those times and in our times. And I split for you the word nowhere, this beautiful line for our Eucharistic prayer that says, looking at the little millipedes crawling, and I said, taking forever to go nowhere, because nowhere is where the present moment always is. And I split the word nowhere into two, and it is now, here. And that's where God is born. God is born here, and God is born now. And there's no time when God is not born, and there is no place in which God is not born. And what about the angels? To whom did they actually appear? According to Luke, the angels appeared to 2 people, to Zechariah, who would be the father of John the Baptist, and to Mary, who would be the mother of Jesus. According to Matthew's Gospel, the only person to whom the angel appears is Joseph. He does not appear to Mary. He doesn't appear to Zechariah, but he appears to Joseph again and again and again in dreams. He appears in a dream and says, do not be afraid to take this woman as your wife, because she's conceived the baby she's carrying by the Holy Spirit. And secondly, get up and take the child and flee into Egypt. Herod is trying to kill the child. And in Egypt, after 2 or 3 years, once Herod has died, Herod, we know from history, died actually in the year 4 BC. So Jesus was actually born about 6 BC. So Joseph is told in a dream in Egypt, okay, Herod is dead, you can go back home. But when he reaches Israel, he finds out that Herod's son Archelaus is now ruling in his stead in Judea. And so the angel warns him, don't live in Judea, go elsewhere. So he goes right up to the north of the country, through Samaria, into Galilee, and settles in a little village called Nazareth. He's not originally from Nazareth. Neither Joseph nor Mary are from Nazareth, in spite of Luke getting it wrong. They're from Judea, but they have to emigrate up north because Archelaus is still in Judea. And then he talks a little bit about virgin births in folklore of various kinds. So Matthew, Luke, and James all agree that Mary was a virgin before she gave birth. But in James' account, the infancy gospel of James, we find that a midwife actually did a digital examination on Mary after Mary had self-delivered, to find out that Mary is still Virgo intacta. And so she's virginal before, during, and after giving birth. So that's the kind of the big surprise that James says. But when you trawl world mythologies, and when you're lucky enough to have lived in places where you can learn different languages and learn different mythologies, you'll find out that the notion of miraculous conceptions is a worldwide phenomenon. I've told you stories from the Celtic tradition about Seán being virginal, kind of miraculously conceived. In Asia, you have the Buddha in India, and you have Confucius and Lao Tzu in China being conceived miraculously. In the Middle East, you have Zoroaster being conceived miraculously, and in Egypt, you have Ra being conceived miraculously. In Greece, you have Prometheus, and you have Alexander the Great being fathered by a god called Marduk. And then in Rome, you have Romulus and Remus with these extraordinary conceptions. And in the New World in Mexico, you have Quetzalcoatl in Mexico being conceived in this fashion. So the notion of virgin births you find all over the world. I talked about the notion of the genealogy of Jesus. And I pointed out that both Matthew and Luke have genealogies of Jesus, but they're radically different. So Matthew shows the genealogy of Jesus in 42 generations. 14 from Abraham to King David, 14 from King David to the Babylonian exile, and 14 from the Babylonian exile to the birth of Jesus. So Matthew begins his genealogy with Abraham, because he's trying to point out that Jesus, is the son of Abraham. He's in the Abrahamic tradition. He's really Jewish. Luke, writing for a Gentile audience, goes in the opposite direction. He starts with Jesus and he works his way backwards. But he doesn't stop when he reaches Abraham. He goes right back to Adam, and he says, and Adam was a son of God. And so in this sense, he's trying to prove that Jesus has a global mission, that he wasn't just sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But you get this real anomaly where in Matthew's gospel, a Jewish writer writing for a Jewish audience, in 42 generations, he only mentions 5 women. And those 5 women all have some kind of a sexual peccadillo attached to them. Because he's writing for an audience that's claiming, how can you claim that the Messiah is born to an unmarried woman, she got pregnant before she was married, and you're claiming he's the Messiah? So he has to justify this in some way. So the first one he picks out is Tamar. Tamar, who lived about 1600 years before Jesus, and who had to dress up as a prostitute in order to seduce her own father-in-law and conceive children. She conceived twins, Perez, and Zippah and Zoar, who became the progenitors, of King David. About the year 1210, you have a second woman called Rahab. And Rahab is actually a professional prostitute living in Jericho who sold out the people of Jericho to the invading Israelite army. And one of them married her, and she gave birth to somebody who was in the lineage of King David. The third person mentioned is Ruth. And all these 3 men are non-Jewish. Ruth, loses her first husband. He dies. And then she's encouraged by her own mother-in-law to seduce a character called Boaz, who's drunk after he's harvested his wine, and he's lying in his vineyard asleep and drunk, and she lifts the corner of his robe, and bingo, she gets pregnant. And she's the great-grandmother of King David. And then you have Bathsheba. Bathsheba is married to a man called Uriah the Hittite, who was a warrior in David's army. And David takes this woman while her husband is in the war, and he lays with her, impregnates her, and then has the husband killed in order that he can marry Bathsheba as his 45th wife or something. And she's the mother of King Solomon. And then finally you have Mary. And so now, if we can accept these other 4 women, none of whom were actually even Jewish, as a part of our lineage, why can't you accept this unmarried woman called Mary? So that was the kind of the thinking that went into it. And then for me, the most important, the last thing I dealt with was looking at all of these characters in the stories. And so particularly when you look at the characters like the angels, the shepherds, the wise men, Herod, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, etc. If you could imagine that this was an extraordinary dream, a cosmic dream. And when you dream at night, you are the creator of your dream. You are the director of your dream. You are the producer of your dream. You create the costumes, you choose the locations, and you create the plot and the dialogue, and you play all of the parts, even though in the dream, you pretend like you're only just the dream ego, but actually you're playing all of the characters in the dream. Now, what if you were to take this extraordinarily beautiful story and then look and see, where am I one of the angels in this dream? Where am I a shepherd in this dream? Where am I one of the wise men in this dream? Where am I Herod in this dream? Where am I Jesus in this dream? Where am I Mary in this dream? And where am I Joseph in this dream? And for the last week, I just focused on 2 of them, because I suggested that for Christmas week, you might take each one of these 7 characters and say, who does that represent in my life or in my time right now? So I took Mary and I took Herod. And I just took 2 phrases that Mary uttered. How can this happen to me? When the angel says, you will become the mother of the Mashiach. She said, how can that happen to me? I have not known man. And she's told it will be the work of the Holy Spirit. You have to trust that you will conceive the Son of God. And that's exactly what each one of us is asked to do. We're asked to trust. We have no idea how it's going to happen, but we have to believe that every single one of us volunteered to give birth to God in this lifetime. Every single one of us volunteered to come down here and give birth to God. And we have no idea how to do it. And the angel is saying, it doesn't matter. All you need to do is trust. Put one foot ahead of the other. Try to be loving in every circumstance. Now, it took 9 months for the child to be carried and birthed. And so often it takes time before we begin to show, before we begin to realize, before the world begins to realize this person is really taking seriously the mission to give birth to God. It takes time to show. It takes time to give birth. So it's going to take patience for every single one of us before we can grow the baby sufficiently that we can birth it and gift it to the world. Every single one of us is meant to be the mother of God. And then I looked at, where is Herod in our times right now? And for me, Herod represents what I've called in the past Homo sociopathicus, that branch of humanity which is dedicated completely to grabbing the resources and controlling the populace and killing anybody it needs to kill if they get in its way. It's the Ahrimanic impulse. And we have plenty of evidence of that in 2022. People like the World Economic Forum, which are claiming you will own nothing and be happy. We'll grab all of the resources and we'll change you in such a way that you become just Homo artificialis. We'll be able to program you and we'll be able to hack your mind. So you become total servants to our agenda. And I made this very important distinction that I received in a dream about 3 weeks ago. I was wrestling with this notion of sin and evil. Is there a difference? And I was told in my dream that sin is the individual transgression of a culturally created law. Like, for instance, when the Catholic Church says, you're going to go to hell for all eternity for eating meat on a Friday. That's a culturally created law, and it is total mishigas. And sin is basically breaking a culturally created precept. That's what sin is. Evil is very different. Evil is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. And we see evidence of that in our times. The tendency and the agenda to totally separate souls from source in every way possible. That is Herod in our times. And a major focus that is exactly as Herod done is to kill the children. A major focus of evil today is the racialization and the sexualization of our children. To tell little newborns that you are born either as a victim or a victimizer. There's no two ways. Depending on the color of your skin, you're born to be a victim or you're born to be a victimizer. For me, that's a whole new version of original sin. That every little newborn is going to fall into one of these categories, and we're going to set them at each other's throats from the word go. Now we're going to bring drag queens into kindergartens to show kids that instead of, here's my daddy, he's an astronaut, here's my mother, she's a surgeon, it is, here's my uncle, he's a drag queen. That this is how we're educating our little children. This is Herod's slaughter of the innocents for the 21st century. And our greatest challenge right now is saving our children from a world gone woke. This is the time for the mama bears. The story of the infancy gospel of James ends with this storyline. It ends with Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt to escape the wrath of Herod, and with the mother of John the Baptist, Elizabeth, asking a mountain literally to open up and give her shelter, which she does. So it's mothers protecting their babies from Herod. The great, I believe, lesson of this Christmas, for me certainly, is making my Christmas about protecting and raising each baby as if it were a Christ child. Namaste, my brothers and sisters. So let's open it up to a Q&A now.
I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about your grandmother's stories and where you think that they came from. I think you had mentioned that before, that you found a similar background, but I can't remember what it was. You mind talking about that?
It's a great question, Jana. So it was fascinating to me that I was hearing stories from my great-grandmother that I never heard in church, and I never heard in 8 years of seminary training, biblical studies, and I didn't hear for years and years and years until I befriended a good guy, an Episcopal priest who was an archdeacon called John Butcher, who wrote a very interesting book called The Uncommon Lectionary. And he asked me, why don't you begin, using readings from the non-canonical Gospels? And so I began to read a lot of the Gnostic material, the pseudo-epigraphica, or the deuterocanonical scriptures, and I came across some of these stories, and I came across a passage that told me that many of these early pseudo-epigraphical Gospels were actually translated into various languages. And one of them was translated into Gaelic, way back in the 7th or 8th century. So when I read this version, I could see where the origin of some of her stories were. Now others, I think perhaps that when you have any storytelling culture, they're going to take a trope or the theme that's really important to them, and then they're going to flesh it out and they're going to build their own stories about it. So some of the stories that Muddy told me, I subsequently discovered in some of the Gnostic scriptures, and others I found no place except in my memory from listening to what she said. So it's interesting that in many different traditions, including the Hebrew traditions, there's an oral tradition and there's a written tradition. And very, very often, the written tradition is much, much younger than the oral tradition. All written traditions originally were oral stories. And so it seems like the oral versions of the story survive much longer than go back much further than the written version. So some of what she got obviously was from translations. Somehow she had access to, or some teacher in her past had access to, and others were stories that the Irish pre-Christian Celtic, mindset was able to create around this archetype of the Christ child. Great question, Jana.
I just had a question about the source book that you mentioned. I was wondering if it was hypothesized the same way that like dark energy isn't technically proven because we just know that it exists because of the effect it has on gravity, or like is it hypothesized or is it real?
That's a brilliant question. So it's fascinating to me because dark matter and dark energy are hypothesized. Dark energy is hypothesized in order to explain why the universe is expanding, and dark matter is hypothesized to account for gravity, that there's something holding the galaxies together. And so, 95% of what's responsible for our universe, we have no idea what it is. So the notion of hypothesizing kind of causation for data that we can kind of empirically test, that's a brilliant, brilliant insight, Ireland. And you're absolutely right that when human beings evolved, let's say Homo sapiens sapiens began just 70,000 years ago. 200,000 years ago, you had Homo sapiens. They were thinking beings, but they didn't have language. And so it took another 130 years for Homo sapiens to become Homo sapiens sapiens. They were thinking beings who could actually think about thinking. And that's the origin of language. And the first use to which they put that newfound ability to express themselves in language, I believe, was storytelling. And the first story they told each other was they were trying to deal with the existential issues. Where did we come from? What happens when we die? Who's responsible for all of this? And so we created these kinds of gods. And it went through 5 stages, I believe. The first group were thinking about trying to figure out who the gods were. And I call that the era of the theologians, trying to figure out who are these gods, and they were always plural. So it's talking about the gods. The second era was talking to the gods. They thought they figured out who the gods were. So now they start creating rituals and prayers to address them. And I call this the era of the priests. They're now creating ritual and prayer to address the gods I think they figured out. The third one is those who speak, I call them the prophets, who purport to speak on behalf of God. They think that they've received special messages and they're going to speak to the rest of us about what God has in mind. And we get prophets in every tradition. So they're speaking on behalf of God. And then the fourth group, I call the mystics. They're the people, they're not speaking about the gods, they're not speaking to the gods, and they're not speaking on behalf of the gods, they're speaking as God, because they've recognized their own inner divinity, that everything that exists is basically a word of God made flesh, and they're speaking from that place. And there's a fifth group, I call them the non-dual mystics, who realize that the ineffability of God cannot even be articulated, and so they don't even attempt to speak. And so, but those who are teachers, they need to employ some kind of language. And the best language is to kind of create stories, to hypothesize an explanation for the empirical experiences we're having in mystical states. That's a brilliant, brilliant question, Arlen. Thanks a million, Pat.
I was very interested and inspired by the process that you guided us through 2 weeks ago of committing to our purpose here on Earth. And you said that this was a really good time to do that.
Yes.
So I was just wondering if you could say anything else about that.
That's brilliant, Robbie. That's really brilliant. Since we have some mathematicians and scientists like Ireland here with her mom this morning, I'm going to use a kind of geometric metaphor. You know the idea of asymptote, something going asymptotic? If you take 2 axes, an x-axis horizontal and a y-axis which is vertical, and if the x-axis represents time and the y-axis represents change, and you look at the amount of change over time, we typically think that there's more change over more time. So you've got a linear graph climbing very, very predictably, somewhere like a 45-degree angle between the x-axis and the y-axis. Now there's a phenomenon called when a graph goes asymptotic, that instead of the graph going in a straight line like this, it begins to curve. And so you're getting more and more change in less and less time. Or finally, you get an infinite amount of change in 0 time. And they call that the graph going asymptotic. And so when change happens so quickly that it takes less and less time for more and more change, you're getting an asymptotic curve. Now, I had a dream just a few nights ago where I saw a 3-dimensional version of an asymptote. And it looked like if you take a pipe, a right circular tube, like a big pipe, like a 6-inch, piece of piping, and you look at a graph inside that. So when we don't learn from our mistakes, we go round and round and round in a circle. We're stuck on a particular plane. We're digging ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper into a rut. But when we're waking up, the circle becomes a spiral. We revisit the same issues many, many times, but every time we do, we deal with it more and more adroitly. Now, in this vision, what I saw was that too can go asymptotic, that the rate at which the spiral is becoming actually a straight shoot up, increases in time. And that we are in a period when that circular movement has become a spiral and the spiral itself is going asymptotic. That if you were to take a kind of a Hindu notion of the Mahayugas, Hinduism teaches that there are 4 great yugas, and they take 24,000 years each, 12,000 in a devolutionary part and 12,000 in an evolutionary part. But then it's replaced, like we're in Kali Yuga right now, in which we regard the world as purely materialistic, and our science reflects that. And we're moving into eventually Satya Yuga, in which we operate as spirits. But in the meantime, we have to go to a second yuga, which is about identifying with energy rather than matter. And a third place where we identify with mentation and ratiocination rather than mere emotion. And then the final stage, identifying with spirit. Now, I think we're at a stage of that asymptotic spiral where things are speeding up more and more and more. And so I'm seeing more and more evidence for light workers in our time. And whenever there are light bringers, you're going to get a final kind of a dying kick from the denizens of the darkness to shut down the whole process. And we're seeing that right now. And I'm particularly concerned about it in the way in which they're really deliberately trying to destroy our children. But the light workers are coming. And so for us to wake up means to be part of that spiral, that asymptotic spiral, so that we walk our talk, so that we refuse to be shut down, that we're operating for love, but love sometimes needs to confront the evil. Part of the growth is confronting the symptomology that's making us sick, and then 80% of it is engaging with a totally different lifestyle, including gratitude that allows us to climb more quickly. So for me, that's the space we're in right now, Robbie.
I understand the cultural changes, and just referred back to it, related to Herod's activities in our lives right now, and the need to counter that with light beings as this curve increases and gets faster. I recall that the reformers and the Reformation all thought that the Pope was the Antichrist in the Book of Revelation, mentioned in the Book of Revelation. Mm-hmm. And I used to think that was just a horrible, terrible accusation. But it appears that the Romanization of Christianity and the merger of religion and the state created this control mechanism that we've all gotten caught up in and are apparently caught up in even to today. So you can't say this categorically about all institutions, but is institutional Christianity Herod-like today?
That's a great question, Tom. So the worst curse that you can place on any emerging spirituality is to give it state blessing, because then you convert it from being a kind of prophetic to being merely institutional. And I've seen that not just in religions, I've seen it in all kinds of organizations, whether they're financial or medical or educational, or agricultural or religious, that you start off with a mystical impulse, some extraordinary avatar like a Buddha figure or a Mahatma Gandhi or a Mother Teresa figure, and very, very quickly then that person is so charismatic that people are flocked to the message. But the vast bulk of the followers don't understand the message. I mean, on the last night of his life, 12 hours before he died, after being with his disciples for 3 years, Philip says to him, you keep talking about the Father. Show us the Father, just show us the Father once, and then we'll believe. And Jesus says, oh, you've asked me. Have I been with you, Philip, for 3 years, and you still don't realize when you see me, you see the Father? In other words, the disciples don't really understand the message of the teacher, but they're attracted by the charisma, and they're like, some part of their soul is set afire, but their intellect is still getting in the way. They're filtering everything through their intellect. And so what happens then, almost inevitably, the avatar or the prophet is assassinated, taken out of operation. And then the disciples, in order to kind of memorialize him, they create some kind of a community. That's stage 3. Stage 3 is the community morphs into an organization. Stage 5 is that some self-appointed oligarchy will rise to the top of the organization and call the shots. Stage 6 is they will insist on some form of orthodoxy. And you've got that, for instance, in 325 at the Council of Nicaea, when Constantine put the council fathers into a session and said, and don't come out until you have a creedal formulation that everybody can get behind. and they came out with the Nicene Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, created heaven and earth. So now you have a doctrine, and you're not allowed to stray for the doctrine. No heterodoxy allowed. And now if anybody steps off, you will have inquisitions, and you literally pull them limb from limb. And then if you get into a position of power where you kind of become the inheritor of the Roman Empire, now you can begin to lead crusades against the Saracens or the Jews, or the infidels, whatever word you want to call them, and march across Eastern Europe and destroy people. And at some stage, some new prophet comes along and says, guys, that is not what the master said, like St. Francis of Assisi. But you're going to go round and round and round in this. And so very, very definitely, when you look at the history of Christianity, again and again and again, you see the same kind of, it's not a spiral, it's a cycle that goes round and round and digs itself deeper and deeper and deeper into institutionalized kind of a dogmatic religion. And certainly the Catholic Church has been a prime example of where that is. And there have been various stages when it's attempted to break through it, temporarily, but almost inevitably, the institution wins out over the community. And so for me, religion is very important. It is very important. It is the training wheels for spirituality. It's a place in which people can come together to do two things, to support each other in their searches and to challenge each other in their belief systems, and to try to create ritual which creates altered states of consciousness so that people can have individual mystical Gnostic experiences. That is the purpose of religion, to set the children free, because religion is the training wheels for spirituality. It should give you a ritual, and it gives you a basis for having personal mystical experiences in which you don't need to be tied to mama's apron strings anymore. But organizations will never do that. And so the Catholic Church and the Christian churches and most of the churches will almost inevitably kind of devolve into organizations focused on orthodoxy rather than orthopraxy, which is good practice. It's what you believe and say yes, sir, to. That's important, not how you live your life. Great question, Tom.
Thomas actually said something before the homily about doing the right things for the wrong reasons. And I was wondering if you could expound upon that.
Yeah. That was a beautiful line that came from Tom's readings. And so it's another version of that is, the end justifies the means. That in some senses, when you have an agenda and it's your version of good, then you begin to believe that in order to educate the ignorant masses, you're entitled to impose this upon them. There was a famous bishop in Cork when I was growing up, whom I idolized and whom I got to meet finally on one-on-one. But he was a professor of philosophy at a huge big seminary. And he made this statement. He said, error has no rights. Error has no rights. So if you perceive something to be an error, they ipso facto lose all their rights. So whatever it takes to convince them of their error, whether that's, inquisition or crusades or crucifixion, you're entitled to it because they forfeit the rights because they're in error. Well, that's a really, really dangerous place. Michael Choi and I have a very good friend called Roger Marsh, who wrote a beautiful book, which I'm just finishing right now, called Truth Bubbles, in which he says the very, very same thing. Every single one of us is locked into, he calls it a truth bubble, my personal reality. And I have to come to realize that everybody on the planet has a different truth bubble. Now, there may be, to use mathematical language, there may be an intersection set between truth bubbles. Okay, you come across a group of people or an individual and there's significant overlap. I know you've kind of created a consensual truth bubble, but then you regard everybody else in the other truth bubbles as being in error, and therefore you have the duty to kind of straighten them out, even if that means going to war against them or having crusades against them. So the intention may be very good. I want to teach them what the truth is, but it's going to be my version of the truth. And I years and years ago, I created a definition of truth where I said that something could be factual but not true, and something can be true but not factual. And for me, the definition of truth is something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth only when it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with Source. And when you're permanently united with Source, you realize that everybody else as well is a bite-sized piece of God, is a holographic fractal. And so when you know the ultimate transformation and the ultimate alignment with God is to recognize the God in everybody else. And then you can't kill anybody. You have to realize, they're finding their way out of the illusions of incarnation, just like I'm fighting my way out of the illusions of incarnation. And I have no more guarantee than they that my particular current version is nearer to the ultimate than is theirs. And so there is no end that justifies, means using violence, whether it's verbal violence, emotional violence, or physical violence.
My question's really quick, and I thought I'd ask you here instead of writing you in case someone else wanted to know. But when you were covering doing the recap of the other homilies, and you spoke about the different versions of Jesus's birth, I thought I heard you reference that there was a text or book that spoke to Mary's birth, and I didn't catch the rest of it. Did you say that? And can you point me to it?
Yep, absolutely. It's a very interesting gospel. It fills in a lot of details you're not going to get in any of the other accounts. It's called the Infancy Gospel of James, and it's from about 150 CE. There's some really great stories in it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, Pat.